you will likely be debating what is the most successful, greatest, whatever superlative you want to use, race car of all time for the rest of time. There are simply too many good ones to choose from R32 GTRs in the Japanese Touring Car Championship to the Lancia Delta Integrale in the World Rally Championship. But one car really encapsulates everything that makes racing great. It's got the looks, it's got the legendary status, it's got the success, and it's got the star power to make you really think that this is the greatest race car of all time. The Porsche 917.
Absolutely 908.
Compared to today, Porsche in the 1960s was a very small sports car company, but with the likes of the 356 and the 911, they had proven themselves capable of winning despite the company's size, and they had realized, like everybody else by 1960, that Le Mans was the big one to win. So Porsche began heavily investing in top-tier Le Mans classes with the likes of the 718, then the 904, then the 906, the 910, the 907 for some reason, they went out of order, don't know why, and then finally the 908. And in 1968, the 908 was the creme de la crop at Le Mans. With its long-tail variant, it was easily the fastest car on the grid that year. And like pretty much everybody but John Wyer, who was given the GT40 program from Ford with 5-liter V8s, Porsche were following the prototype 2-liter and 3-liter regulations, because then you only had to make one car for the race itself. The other 5-liter class required a homologation run of 25 cars. Now, Ford met those requirements in 1964, which is why Wyer was able to race, but everybody else simply avoided the hassle and ran with smaller engines. Except for Porsche. Porsche likes to read the rules. A lot. And they saw a loophole in the 5-liter sports car regulations. And that loophole was, as long as you built 25 of them, you could do whatever you wanted. So their idea was to build 25 prototype cars. And then they could enter a prototype with a 5-liter engine. It would be the best of both worlds, the technology of a prototype with the power of a 5-liter sports car. But that's expensive. Real expensive. And it took a whole year of deliberation for Porsche to finally sign off on the project. And using an open-top variant of the 908 as a starting point, they went from deliberation to working race car in just 10 months. It was designed in a wind tunnel and stood just 36 inches tall, making it super streamlined from the Mulsanne Straits. But then there was the engine. Porsche had never made a 5-liter engine before, much less a 12-cylinder engine. So they went old school. They upscaled the displacement of 2 of their flat 6s, and then simply bolted them together. That's why the 917's cooling fan is in the center of the engine. It was a beast that made 520 horsepower in 1969, more than any other Porsche in history by some margin. But this is supposed to be a road car, so Porsche had to add a passenger seat, turn signals, a handbrake, and the ability to switch the exhaust for something that wouldn't shatter glass going through the city. But the bigger problem were the storage spaces. Race cars are meant to be as small as possible, but the 5-liter rules required room for a spare wheel and luggage. Now the luggage was solved by 2 little trays behind the rear wheels that were only used for mechanics during race weekends, but technically they could be considered storage. And the spare wheel was solved with the development of one of the first modern space savers behind the engine. So with 2 days to spare, all 25 917s were laid out before the inspectors. And despite the rumors about truck axles being used, all of them were fully finished 911s except for one which had the wrong suspension. And you know what? You could buy a 917 for 16,000 euros. Not bad until you realize that in 1969 it was 10 times the price of a 911. And even with that ludicrous price tag, Porsche lost money hand over fist. Now you could technically register your 917 for the road if you so choose, but only 3 of them ever did. The rest went to do its job. Race. And it was a disaster. Congratulations, you spent all this money and built an engineering masterpiece that also happened to be a death trap. Aerodynamics were still in their infancy, and the wind tunnel clearly had issues because the downforce generating long tail actually generated lift, which is not what you want when going 238 miles an hour down the Le Mans Straight. And the drivers hated it, not just because it was lethal, but because the 908 was objectively better. In fact, at Le Mans that year, 1969, the 908 proved it, because the 917s were brutally faster in qualifying and during the race, but they were unreliable and dangerous. Porsche driver John Wolf was killed in a lap 1 accident in his 917, while all the others retired with oil leaks and gearbox issues, with the latter breaking down having led the race for 22 hours. And in the end, it was John Wyer's GT40 that beat Porsche's reserve 908 by just 120 meters. Safe to say, Porsche did not have a good weekend. One driver killed, a backup car having to lead the fight, and their expensive gamble falling to pieces. And even worse, when they set out to do the 917 program, they were fully aware that the rules would only last until 1971 and then a new series would begin. It was now or never to fix the 917. So Porsche contacted an expert, the same John Wyer who beat them with the GT40 in 1969, and they asked him to take over the 917 program. And he saw the 917 when it launched at Geneva, and he knew immediately upon seeing it that that was the future, so he accepted. And after a miracle win in Austria in the end of 1969, they stayed at that Austrian racetrack and continued testing the 917 along with its Can-Am variant from America. And what they found was shocking. The Can-Am car had basically the same internals, but it was much faster than the Le Mans car, and the only difference was the body. And one of the Wyer engineering team engineers saw that there were lots of bugs across the entire body of the car except for the wing, and he deduced that since there were no bugs on the wing, there was no air on the wing. So on the spot, they beat some pieces of aluminum into shape on the pit wall, and then duct tape and screwed them to the back of a 917 in a wing-shaped thing. And with just beat-up aluminum, duct tape, and some screws, the 917 finished testing a whole 5 seconds a lap faster than before. 5 seconds with just some beat-up aluminum from a pit wall. The 917K proved that the bodywork was the missing piece of a brilliant puzzle. The now functioning aero worked with the perfect chassis and the perfect brakes and the bigger 600 horsepower flat 12 to make the K unstoppable. But at the debut of the 1970 24 Hours of Daytona, the new Ferrari 512 scored a suspicious pole position. But this time it wasn't Ferrari cheating. It was a valuable lesson in why anti-sandbagging rules are important, because as soon as that green flag dropped, the quote-unquote slower Porsches disappeared off into the distance, never to be seen again. Pole position doesn't matter in a 24-hour race, and even with a broken clutch, the 917 scored a 1-2 on its debut. And they didn't just score a 1-2 finish. They crushed Ferrari's pole position time by 5 seconds, and the winning 917 finished 45 laps ahead of its teammate, who in turn beat the next best Ferrari in third by another 3 laps. It's the biggest winning margin in Daytona history. In fact, I can't go on record for sure, but it's definitely one of the biggest winning margins in endurance racing history. A 45 lap advantage in 24 hours. Then they DNF'd at Sebring and went on to their ultimate quest at Le Mans. And it was pretty much perfect. They had the performance experience from Daytona, the mechanical experience from Sebring, and they owned Le Mans in 1970. Porsche brought 7 917s, including both the K and the new long-tail variant, to cover their bases. And the long tail, driven by Vic Elford, broke the 3-minute and 20-second barrier while qualifying on pole position. And to be fair, a lot of 917s broke, but 2 of them did not. And they simply paraded around Le Mans without fear of retaliation from Ferrari, with the 917 driven by Dickie Atwood leading by 5 laps, taking victory, followed by another 917 and another 908 for good measure, which meant on their first win, Porsche secured a total podium lockout. And that was just the start. Porsche won every single event in the 1970 World Sports Car Championship except for Sebring, and with the help of a certain Steve McQueen and his certain Le Mans movie, the 917 became one of the most famous cars of all time. And it was only just getting started, because in 1971, the 917 Le Mans program reached its zenith in the form of the 630 horsepower thin-sprouted 917 LH. The improved long-tail variant was a juggernaut that racing had never seen before. Despite serious competition from Roger Penske, Porsche took it all in 1971, easily clinching the World Sports Car title. But that doesn't mean they didn't experiment. The 917-20 Pink Pig was a test vehicle for low-drag aerodynamics. It was wider, lower, and more stubby. And despite the fact that it was, at its core, an R&D vehicle and not a race car, they decided what better way to do some research than race it at Le Mans in 1971. And you know what? It performed better than expected for being an R&D car, qualifying 7th and running all the way up to 5th before it snapped and flung itself into the barrier. And now it proved to be an outlier for Porsche, because the 917 LHs would set records that would stand for decades. And here's why. Apart from the vehicle being fantastic, in 1971 the straightaway had no kinks. Yellow flags were infrequent at best, and that year's event had virtually no rain. And therefore the number 22, driven by Gijs van Lennep and Helmut Marko, yep, the Red Bull guy, didn't know he raced at Le Mans, but there you go. They won outright with an average speed of 138 miles an hour, covering 5,335 kilometers. A distance record that would stand for 39 years. They also blew through the speed traps at 240 miles an hour, a record held until 1988. But, I'm sorry, I just can't get over the fact that those guys drove from Paris to New York in 24 hours. But incredibly, that was just one of 8 Porsche victories that year. And then that was it. Technically, the Porsche 917's last endurance race finished in 1971, and the 936 took over in 1975. But we aren't done quite yet. The 917 enjoyed a much longer career in Can-Am, starting out with a 917 PA in 1969-1970, but they proved to be no match for the McLarens. But after the Le Mans program folded in 1971, Porsche were able to focus all of their efforts on taking down their British rivals. And they tried some pretty crazy stuff, most notably a 750 horsepower V16 variant that didn't really handle that well, so they scrapped it, and partnered with Penske to create the equally mad 850 horsepower 917-10K, these names are getting awful by the way, in 1972. This used a twin-turbocharged flat 12 to keep the car balanced in the weight distribution front, and it was enough to break the McLaren stranglehold to take the title. So Penske and Porsche didn't rest on their laurels and improved the 10K into the 30. And well, the 917-30 was, simply put it, the most powerful circuit car to ever race. In race trim, it made 1,100 horsepower, about as much as a modern F1 car. But in qualifying trim, with the turbos boosted all the way up, that went up to nearly 1,600 horsepower, or 100 more than the most powerful F1 car in history. With that monstrous engine and a newer, more stable platform, Porsche won all but 2 races that season. They were so dominant that, along with the recent oil crisis, Can-Am imposed a 3 mpg fuel economy on the series. Now, what does that mpg rule have to do with Porsche? Well, the 917-30 got an incredible 1.7 mpg. Yeah, believe it or not, a twin-turbocharged flat 12 from 1973 is not very fuel efficient. With them already winning twice in a row and seeing that the class is heading towards extinction with the new rules, Porsche didn't see the point in racing anymore, and the 1974 title went to Shadow, with a privateer 917 being well off the pace. But now, Porsche had a dilemma. They had this fantastic car and nowhere to race it, so as a retirement celebration, they did the only logical thing: set an FIA speed record for a closed circuit. So 1975, Mark Donohue took the Penske 917-30 around Talladega Superspeedway. Sure, it's an oval track, but the FIA still qualifies it as a closed circuit, and the 917 got up to 221.16 miles an hour average. A record only eclipsed by IndyCar during the Indy 500. And with that, the Porsche 917 was done. But there's a big emphasis on the word Porsche, because technically this next car isn't a Porsche, it's a Kremer. Now, Kremer Racing is a legend, especially at Le Mans, having won 1979 event outright with the 935 K3, and they noticed something in the 1981 rulebook. With Group 5 and Group 6 being replaced by Group C in 1982, there was a void in the Le Mans class structure for 1980 and 1981. For some reason, they didn't overlap like they do on normal series. This allowed privateer John Rondeau to win in his own car in 1980, and Kremer liked his style, so they would build their own car out of a 917. That would be a big hurdle, but luckily they had some help. Now, Porsche were busy on their own Group C car, the 956, but they still gave Kremer any spare parts collecting dust in the back and the original technical drawings. But this wasn't some stupid sequel rehash like Terminator Genesis. This was a top-of-the-line race car mixed with old-fashioned brute force. So it had the 600 horsepower flat 12, but also had technology a decade newer than the 917. Stickier tires, a re-engineered frame now significantly more rigid, and smoother bodywork with better aerodynamics. In theory, because Kremer didn't have a wind tunnel, and it was all guesswork and engineering know-how. And then Kremer learned that you really need a wind tunnel, since the bodywork was actually restricting airflow to the engine, and added a bit too much drag for a track with a 3-mile-long straightaway. Yeah, the K81, as it was called, qualified 18th. But it did make its way up to 9th, before being run off the road, sprouting an oil leak and DNFing. It did get one more chance, though, at the 1,000 kilometers of Brands Hatch, where it was leading the race, until suspension failure DNF'd the car, and the 917 was once and truly, forever, retired. But is it? Because looking back on it, even 60 years later, near enough, the 917 is one of the greatest cars in history. The liveries are all icons. It doesn't matter if it's the Martini or the Gulf or the Salzburg, it doesn't matter. It's fantastic. The styling looks like it was done by a coach builder, not science. And it had class-ending speed on both sides of the Atlantic. And it proved that Porsche was capable of winning at Le Mans. And they're now the most successful manufacturer in history with 19 wins in their trophy case. And the 917 gave them those first 2 wins. I said at the beginning, it's arguably the most dominant race car of all time. Nothing could even touch it for 2 years before it hung its hat up, dropped the mic, and called it a day.